I'm surprised. 3 Corporal of Horse on duty. It was the kind of morning that hinted at adventure, though no one in the camp could have predicted what was about to unfold. 3 young men, each a corporal of horse, were preparing for what seemed like a regular day. They had their routines, brushing down their horses, checking their saddles, and exchanging quiet greetings as they went about their work. Their duties had always been clear: patrolling the grounds, keeping the horses in top condition, and maintaining order. The life of a corporal of horse was one of responsibility, discipline, and pride. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. The horses they cared for were not just animals. They were their partners in the field, their trusted companions in every task they performed. Corporal James Caldwell was the first to notice something odd. He had been in the military for 4 years and had never seen the camp buzz with this much energy so early in the morning. The commanding officer's office had its door open, a rare sight, and a few officers were gathered outside, speaking in hushed voices. James was a strong, tall man with broad shoulders that made him stand out among the others. His hair was dark, neatly combed back, and his expression often appeared serious, almost stern. But those who knew him well understood that his tough exterior was just that, an exterior. Inside, he was a man of deep thought, someone who took pride in his duties and valued the traditions of the military above all else. James couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. He pushed open the door of the stable and glanced toward his fellow corporals. The second corporal, Daniel Hayes, was already feeding his horse, a beautiful chestnut stallion with a glossy coat that glistened in the morning light. Daniel was the complete opposite of James. Where James was solid and dependable, Daniel was quick-witted and a bit of a joker. His smile was almost always on his face, and he had a knack for lifting the spirits of those around him. Though James admired his optimism, he often found himself wishing Daniel would take things a little more seriously. After all, their work was important, and it wasn't the kind of job that left room for careless mistakes. The third corporal, Thomas King, was standing by the stables, carefully adjusting his uniform. He was the quiet one of the trio, a man of few words but many thoughts. Thomas had joined the military when he was younger, driven by a sense of duty that had been instilled in him by his family. His father had been a decorated officer, and Thomas had always felt the weight of that legacy on his shoulders. He wasn't as outgoing as Daniel or as physically imposing as James, but there was a calm strength to him that made him someone the others could rely on. He had a way of observing things without saying much, always reading the situation before acting. It was this quiet wisdom that made him invaluable to the team. "Have you heard?" James asked, approaching Daniel and Thomas. Daniel looked up from the horse, a playful grin on his face. "Heard what?" "The officers," James said, nodding toward the door of the commanding officer's office. "They're acting strange. Something's up." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. He had always been the type to wait for more information before jumping to conclusions. But even he couldn't deny that there was an unusual sense of tension in the air. Just as James was about to say something more, a sharp whistle broke through the quiet of the stable. All 3 men turned to see their commanding officer, Captain Richardson, standing at the entrance. Captain Richardson was a man of middle age, known for his no-nonsense attitude and stern commands. He had a reputation for being fair but tough, and he expected nothing less than perfection from his soldiers. "Caldwell, Hayes, King," Captain Richardson called out, his voice carrying across the stables. The 3 corporals straightened up, instinctively saluting. "At ease," the captain said, his expression serious. He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "You 3 have been selected for a special duty today. I need you to report to the headquarters immediately." The words were like a thunderclap in the calm morning air. Special duty. It was rare for corporals to be called upon for anything outside their usual responsibilities. This was different, and the uncertainty of it sent a ripple of tension through the group. "Special duty, sir?" James asked, his voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. The captain nodded, his face grim. "Yes, you'll be briefed on the details when you get there. I trust you'll follow orders without hesitation." Without another word, Captain Richardson turned and strode off, his boots clicking on the hard ground with each step. The three corporals exchanged uneasy glances. "Do you think it's something serious?" Daniel asked, his usual light-hearted tone replaced with a hint of concern. James glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "It must be. The captain doesn't call us for something like this unless it's important." Thomas, who had been unusually silent, now spoke up. "We'll find out soon enough. Let's not waste time guessing." They mounted their horses in silence, each lost in their thoughts as they rode toward headquarters. The stable that had been a place of routine just moments before now felt miles away, and the weight of the unknown loomed heavily over them. As they reached the headquarters, the sight of the officers standing outside only added to the unease in the air. They were standing at attention, as if waiting for something, waiting for them. The corporals dismounted and walked toward the group, feeling the eyes of their peers on them. Captain Richardson was waiting by the door, his gaze sharp. "You've been selected for a special task. The details are classified, but it's a high-priority mission. You'll be briefed on the specifics by Lieutenant Wills." The three corporals nodded, still unsure of what lay ahead. What had started as a regular day was quickly becoming something far more significant. The air was thick with anticipation as they followed the captain inside. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it would change their lives forever. As they entered the briefing room, the three corporals felt a growing sense of anticipation. The air was thick with uncertainty, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they followed Captain Richardson to a long wooden table where Lieutenant Wills was waiting. Lieutenant Wills was known for his strict but fair nature. He was a man who preferred to get straight to the point, and his reputation for no-nonsense leadership had earned him the respect of everyone in the camp. "Gentlemen," Lieutenant Wills began, his voice low but commanding, "today's assignment is unlike anything you've faced before. This is a task that requires precision, focus, and most of all, teamwork. There are no room for mistakes." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the three corporals. They had been through many challenges in their time in the service, but the way Lieutenant Wills spoke made this feel different. They weren't just being asked to patrol or manage the horses. No, this mission was something much more important, something serious. "Your task will take you far beyond the boundaries of this camp," Lieutenant Wills continued, pushing a map across the table. "You will travel to a remote location that is known to be dangerous. There are rumors of unusual activity in the area, and it is up to you to investigate. Your role is to gather information, assess the situation, and report back. You will be acting as scouts and soldiers both. Your success could determine the future of this region, and perhaps the safety of many." The three corporals exchanged uneasy glances. They were accustomed to riding out on patrols, checking the perimeter for threats or assisting in minor skirmishes, but this was far beyond the ordinary. The mention of dangerous was enough to send a ripple of tension through them. "You three have been chosen because you each possess a unique set of skills," Lieutenant Wills said, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Caldwell, you have the strength and experience. Hayes, you've got the quick thinking and adaptability. And King, you're the quiet strategist, the one who can read the land and the people. Together, you are the best chance we have to complete this mission." The words felt like a weight on their shoulders. They had always worked as a team, but now it felt as if the fate of the mission rested solely on them. The pressure was mounting, and each of them felt it in different ways. James stood tall, his expression serious, but inside, a knot of uncertainty was forming. Daniel, usually the one to crack jokes in tense moments, felt a cold chill run down his spine. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to lighten the mood. And Thomas, ever calm and composed, couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was more than just a simple assignment. He had seen enough to know that when things started out with so much secrecy, they rarely ended well. "We leave in an hour," Lieutenant Wills added, folding the map and pushing it toward them. "Prepare yourselves, and remember, stay focused. There is no room for failure." The trio nodded silently, the gravity of the situation settling in. As they exited the room, Captain Richardson's earlier words echoed in their minds. This mission would change their lives forever. It was becoming clearer that this wouldn't be like any other assignment they had been on. Outside, the camp was a blur of activity. Soldiers were moving about, preparing for their own tasks. The routine of the camp seemed to go on as normal, but for the three corporals, it felt as if the world had shifted. The mission ahead was something they hadn't prepared for, and that uncertainty hung over them like a dark cloud. "I don't like this," James said as they walked toward the stables. "We don't know what we're walking into, and that's never a good sign." Daniel, usually the optimist, didn't offer his usual cheerful reply. Instead, he simply gave a nod. "Yeah, it feels off. But we've got our orders. We can't back out now." Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "I think we need to trust our instincts. If we're cautious and stick together, we can handle whatever comes our way." They reached the stables, and the familiar scent of horses and leather brought some comfort. It was a strange thing to find solace in something as simple as the smell of a horse's coat, but in that moment it grounded them. They had cared for these horses for months, had spent countless hours with them. Their horses were more than just animals, they were family, and they would need them now more than ever. James approached his horse, a large gray gelding named Thor. He ran his hand down the horse's neck, the rhythmic motion calming his nerves. Thor was a strong, reliable animal, just like James. The two had been through a lot together, and James knew the horse would carry him through whatever lay ahead. Daniel's horse was a fiery chestnut stallion named Blaze. The animal was full of energy, always eager to go and never backing down from a challenge. Daniel had always felt a special connection with Blaze, their personalities matching in many ways. Where Daniel was bold and sometimes impulsive, Blaze was quick to act. Together they made a formidable pair. Thomas, ever the quiet one, approached his horse with calm precision. His horse, a black mare named Shadow, was known for her grace and intelligence. Shadow was not the fastest, but she was incredibly steady and reliable, much like Thomas himself. He knew that Shadow would carry him through the hardest of times, and that trust gave him a sense of peace as they prepared for the unknown. As they saddled their horses and made their final preparations, the reality of the mission began to set in. There were no more distractions, no more time to wonder about the details. They were going into the unknown, and there was no turning back. "I guess this is it," Daniel said, his voice more serious than usual. "We ride out, do our job, and return, simple as that." James gave him a sidelong glance. "I wish it were that simple." "We've got each other," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady, "and that's all we need." With that, they mounted their horses and rode out of the stable, heading toward the unknown. The camp grew smaller behind them, and the world ahead stretched out in front of them, vast and uncertain. They were on their way to something that could change everything, but for now, they focused on the task at hand. As they left the familiar surroundings of the camp and rode toward the unknown, the weight of their mission hung heavy on their shoulders. But they knew that together they could face whatever came their way. They had been chosen for this task for a reason, and now it was time to prove themselves. The journey out of camp was longer than they had anticipated. The air, once crisp and fresh, had become thick with dust, swirling around their horses as they rode. Each step of their journey took them further into unfamiliar territory, away from the safety and routine of the camp, and towards something that none of them could fully comprehend. As they moved farther from the camp, the familiar terrain of rolling hills and fields began to change. The landscape became more rugged, the path winding through dense forests, with tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. The sun, once bright and high, now hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to creep along the ground. The sounds of the forest filled the air, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. James, always the leader of the group, was the first to notice the shift. He slowed his horse slightly, his gaze scanning the path ahead. His senses were on high alert. They had been riding for several hours now, but something about the silence that hung in the air felt off. The normal sounds of the forest seemed to have faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. He wasn't one to easily be rattled, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Daniel, who had been riding alongside him, noticed the shift in James's posture. "You feeling it too?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. James nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, something's not right." Thomas, who had been trailing behind, didn't say anything at first. He was always the quiet one, but the silence had begun to wear on him as well. He had been trained to observe, to take in every detail and analyze the situation before reacting. But now, as the forest grew denser and the path more difficult, even he couldn't ignore the sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. "There's a village up ahead," Thomas said after a moment, his voice steady but tinged with caution. "We should stop there for the night. We could use the rest, and it might help us gather some information about what's going on in this area." James thought about it for a moment. The village would provide them with shelter and possibly useful information, but it also meant that they would be closer to whatever dangers lay in wait. Still, it seemed like the best option for now. "All right," James said, his voice firm. "Let's head to the village. Stay sharp, though. We don't know what we're walking into." The trio pushed on, and after a few more hours of difficult riding, they finally reached the village. It was a small settlement, nestled at the edge of the forest, with simple cottages built close together. The streets were quiet, the windows dark, and the doors tightly shut. The village didn't seem to be in a state of celebration or festivity, but rather in a quiet, almost solemn state. As they entered the village, they were met with cautious stares from the few villagers who were out and about. A few old men sat outside a small tavern, their faces weathered and worn from years of hard living. They didn't smile as the corporals passed by, instead offering them looks of wariness, as if they were not entirely sure what to make of the newcomers. James dismounted and approached one of the old men. "We're traveling through," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need to know if there's anything unusual going on in the area, any strange happenings." The old man squinted at him, sizing him up before responding. "Strange happenings. There's always something strange about this place. Folks have been talking about shadows in the woods, strange lights in the sky at night, and things that just don't make sense." James exchanged a glance with Daniel and Thomas. Shadows in the woods, lights in the sky. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. "We're just passing through," James said, his voice steady. "But we'll keep our eyes open. Thanks for the information." The old man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Be careful. The woods don't take kindly to strangers." With that, they moved on, finding a small inn at the center of the village. The innkeeper was a young woman, her eyes tired but kind. She welcomed them in and offered them a small meal and a room for the night. As they sat down to eat, the three corporals couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settling in their stomachs. The village felt off. The silence, the cautious glances, they were all warning signs, though no one had outright said it. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, and a stew that had been cooked earlier in the day, but it was filling. They ate in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Daniel, ever the optimist, tried to break the tension with a joke, but even he couldn't muster the energy to laugh. Thomas, who had been quiet throughout the meal, spoke up. "I think we should head into the woods tomorrow," he said, his voice low. "If there's something strange happening, it's probably in there. We need to figure out what's going on before we get too far into this." James nodded, his face serious. "Agreed. We'll set out at first light, but we need to be careful. Whatever's out there, whether it's people, animals, or something else entirely, it's clear that we're not the only ones who have noticed it." The night passed slowly, and none of them slept well. The sounds of the village, distant murmurs, the creaking of wood, the rustling of leaves, seemed to come from all directions. At one point, James thought he heard footsteps outside their window, but when he looked, there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched lingered, and it was difficult to shake off. The next morning, after a restless night, the corporals saddled their horses and prepared to leave the village. The innkeeper gave them a solemn farewell, and the villagers watched them from a distance, their faces still guarded and uncertain. As they rode out of the village and toward the woods, the sense of unease only deepened. The forest was thick and dark, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The path was narrow, winding, and at times barely passable. The deeper they went, the quieter the world seemed to become. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, were gone. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. James, Daniel, and Thomas pressed on, their horses, hooves the only sound breaking the silence. They didn't know what awaited them in the heart of the forest, but they were ready to find out. Whatever strange happenings had been reported in the village, they were determined to uncover the truth. And so, with their minds set and their hearts heavy with uncertainty, the three corporals rode deeper into the woods, unaware of the dangers that lay ahead. The real challenge was just beginning. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the stranger things became. The path, once clear and manageable, began to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the forest itself was trying to confuse them, leading them further into its dark heart. James rode at the front, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, his senses heightened. The silence was overwhelming, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. The usual rustle of leaves or calls of birds seemed to have vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. Daniel, always the one to lighten the mood, tried to crack a joke, though his voice had a nervous edge to it. "Looks like we've entered a haunted forest. Maybe we'll find a ghost or two along the way." James gave him a sideways glance but didn't smile. "This is no time for jokes, Daniel. We need to stay focused." Thomas, riding quietly behind, was unusually still. His eyes scanned the surroundings, taking in every detail. The forest seemed unnaturally dark, even though it was still midday. He could feel it. The air was thick, heavy, as though something was watching them from the shadows. They had been riding for hours, and the forest was showing no signs of thinning. The trees towered above them, their branches intertwining to block out much of the sky. The path they followed had become more difficult to navigate, with large roots sticking out of the ground and rocks hidden beneath the dense underbrush. The horses moved carefully, stepping around obstacles, but it was clear they were getting tired. So were the men. After a long stretch of silent riding, James pulled his horse to a stop. "Let's take a break," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. "We've been riding too long and we don't know what's ahead. We need to stay sharp." The three men dismounted, their boots crunching on the dry leaves. As they sat on a nearby fallen log, the air seemed even heavier. Daniel pulled out a canteen and passed it around, though none of them drank much. They were all too tense, too aware of the strange quiet around them. "We need to figure out what's going on here," James said, breaking the silence. "There's something wrong with this forest, something we're not seeing." Thomas nodded, his face serious. "I agree. The village was strange, and now this. It's not just the path or the silence, it's the way everything feels, like we're not supposed to be here." Daniel's usual joking demeanor faded as he realized the seriousness in Thomas's words. He looked around. as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. "I don't know, guys. Maybe we should have just stayed back at the village." "At least there we could have asked more questions." James shook his head. "No, we're here now and we're not turning back. Whatever's happening, we need to see it through." After a few moments of quiet, Thomas spoke again. "I think I've seen something up ahead, a clearing. It could be a good place to rest, or maybe it's where we'll find some answers." James nodded. "Lead the way." They mounted their horses again, the tension still thick in the air as they rode deeper into the forest. The path grew more rugged, but Thomas's sharp eyes led them through it. Finally, they came to the clearing Thomas had spotted. It was a wide open space, a stark contrast to the dense forest around it. The sunlight that managed to break through the thick trees now bathed the clearing in a soft, golden light. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The stillness seemed almost unnatural. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, covered in ivy and moss. The well seemed out of place, like an ancient relic forgotten by time. The men approached cautiously, their horses stepping lightly on the soft grass. There was something strange about the well, something that made James's instincts flare. "I don't like this," James muttered under his breath. He felt drawn to the well but also repelled by it. It was as if the air around it was charged, like static before a storm. "I don't know, James," Daniel said, looking around nervously. "It's just a well. What could it be?" Thomas, who had been silently observing, dismounted and walked toward the well. "I've heard stories," he said quietly, his voice distant. "Old stories about places like this. Wells that aren't just wells but gateways. Places where the boundaries between the real world and something darker are thin." James frowned. "You're not seriously suggesting that, are you?" Thomas shrugged but didn't answer. Instead, he crouched beside the well and peered inside. The darkness at the bottom seemed endless, as if it was a void that went on forever. His eyes narrowed, and a chill ran down his spine. "There's something down there," Thomas said softly. Before James could respond, a sudden movement in the trees caught their attention. It was quick, too quick for their eyes to follow. Something or someone was watching them from the edge of the clearing. Daniel's hand instinctively went to his sword hilt, his eyes scanning the forest. "Did you see that?" Daniel asked, his voice low. James nodded, his hand tightening on the reins of his horse. He didn't know what was out there, but he could feel it. The air had grown colder, the oppressive stillness replaced by a sense of urgency. "We're not alone," James said, his voice tense. "Everyone, stay close. Stay alert." The three men closed ranks, their horses shifting nervously under them. The trees around them seemed to close in, the shadows deeper than before. The clearing, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a trap. A voice, soft and almost indistinguishable, carried through the air. It was faint at first, but as the seconds passed it grew louder, clearer. It was a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. "Leave this place, or face the consequences." The voice was haunting, like a wind blowing through the trees, but it carried a weight of warning. The men froze. It wasn't just a threat, it was a command. James's hand went to his sword. "We need to leave," he said, his voice sharp. "Now." Before they could make a move, the ground beneath them trembled. The horses neighed in panic, rearing up as if trying to escape something unseen. The trees around the clearing seemed to bend, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The air grew colder, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the space, coming from the well. Something was emerging from the depths. The ground beneath them shook once more, stronger this time, as if the very earth was reacting to the unseen force below. The horses, already on edge, bolted, pulling at their reins in a wild panic. The three corporals struggled to maintain control, but the horses were too frantic. James's own horse, Thor, reared up, nearly throwing him from the saddle. The other two horses followed suit, their hooves pounding the earth in a frenzy. "Hold them!" James shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "Hold on!" But it was clear the horses were not going to calm down on their own. Daniel was the first to dismount, grabbing his horse's reins and pulling the animal toward a nearby tree to steady it. Thomas followed, his movements smooth and practiced as he held onto his mare, Shadow. James, still gripping Thor's reins tightly, finally managed to calm his horse enough to stop the chaos. They stood there in the middle of the clearing, their hearts racing as the world around them seemed to shift and change. The air was colder now, the silence louder than ever. Something was coming, something they couldn't see but could feel deep in their bones. The trees seemed to sway, even though there was no wind. The very earth beneath them felt as if it were pulsing, alive with some ancient energy. "What's happening?" Daniel asked, his voice low, almost breathless. His eyes scanned the clearing, searching for something, anything that would explain what was going on. "I don't know," James answered, his own voice tight with fear. "But I think it's coming from the well." Thomas, who had been silent for the longest time, finally spoke. "The well? It's not just a well, it's something else. I don't know what it is, but I've heard stories, old legends. They say that some wells were never meant to be touched, that they hold things." "Dark things." James turned to face him. "What do you mean, dark things?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "Things from another world, spirits, forces. I don't know the details, but the people who built these wells, they didn't just dig them for water. They built them to contain something, something dangerous." The three men fell silent, the weight of Thomas's words settling heavily between them. In the distance, the rumbling from the well continued, growing louder, as if something deep below the earth was stirring, awakening from a long slumber. "We need to leave," Daniel said, urgency in his voice. "This is too much. Whatever's down there, it's not something we should mess with." But James wasn't ready to retreat just yet. His instincts as a soldier, his sense of duty, and the pride he felt for being chosen for this mission held him in place. He wasn't one to back down, not without knowing the truth. "We can't just leave," James said firmly. "We have to find out what's going on. If we don't, whatever's down there will just keep spreading and we'll never know the full story." Thomas looked at him, his brow furrowed in thought. "You really think we can stop it?" "I don't know," James admitted, "but we can't let fear control us. We're soldiers. It's our job to face what others can't." Daniel, who had been pacing, finally stopped. He looked between his comrades and sighed. "You're right, we came this far, we can't back out now." With a shared nod, the three men gathered their courage and turned back toward the well. The rumbling had stopped, but the sense of dread was still thick in the air. They moved closer, their steps slow, cautious. The trees around them seemed to lean inward, as if watching them, waiting for them to make their move. As they approached the well, they could see the ground around it had begun to crack, small fissures spreading outward like veins in the earth. The stone walls of the well, once covered in ivy, now looked even older, more worn, as if the earth itself had aged them in response to whatever was stirring below. James was the first to approach the well, kneeling beside it. He peered into the depths, but all he could see was darkness, an endless black that seemed to draw him in. There was no sound from below, no indication of what lay waiting there. Then, without warning, a deep voice echoed from the well. It was not a voice like a human's, but something ancient and powerful, a voice that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "Why have you come?" The three men froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a presence, filling the air around them, seeping into their minds. It was all-encompassing, and it felt like the ground beneath them was speaking. "We didn't come here to disturb you," James called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We were sent to investigate, to understand what's happening in this forest." The voice responded, its tone dark and echoing. "You are not the first to seek answers. Many have come before you seeking the truth, and like them you will not leave unchanged." A cold wind rushed up from the well, swirling around the men and their horses. The trees seemed to groan, the earth trembling beneath their feet. The horses whinnied in fear, their bodies stiff with terror. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted, stepping forward, his hand gripping his sword hilt. "We didn't come to fight, we just want to know what's happening." The voice from the well grew louder, almost shaking the ground beneath them. "You seek answers, but you do not understand the cost. The forest is alive and it will not let you go. You are bound to it now. There is no turning back." The air seemed to grow colder, and James felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to his comrades, his mind racing. They couldn't leave, not with this power beneath the earth, not with whatever ancient force was watching them from the shadows. "We need to destroy it," James said, his voice determined. "We can't let this thing continue, it's too dangerous." Thomas nodded, his face grim. "Agreed. We need to stop it or it will keep growing. We can't let it spread." But as they moved to take action, the ground suddenly cracked open beneath them. The earth shifted violently, throwing them off their feet. The well's stone walls cracked, and from within something began to rise, something dark, shifting, and monstrous, its shape impossible to comprehend. In that moment, the three corporals knew they were facing something far beyond anything they had ever encountered. Their training, their courage, everything they had relied on in the past seemed inadequate in the face of this ancient terror. But they knew they had no choice. They couldn't run. They had to stand their ground. They drew their swords and prepared for whatever would come next, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest was no longer just a place. They were in the heart of a battle between light and darkness, and they would fight until the very end, no matter what it cost.